Our last speaker for this session is David Rosario. David recently joined Iowa State University as an assistant professor. His research program will focus on conducting applied research on swine nutrition and smart farming, with special emphasis on developing technologies to improve sow survivability and longevity. David is passionate about training and inspiring the next generation of professionals in the development of innovation to advance swine industry. He previously served at Hanor Company as a technical officer, overseeing the nutrition programs, research, and innovation efforts. His research contributions to the swine industry include the understanding of nutritional value of dietary lipids and essential fatty acids on sow long-term productivity. Please help me welcome David Rosario, and as we look forward to his presentation on maximizing sow lifetime productivity.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Mark. It is an honor for me to be here. Termont here in Iowa State. I feel fantastic. So appreciate your presence here. My intent today is to go a little more practical, but show you data on key aspects on the sow feeding. So I hope I can spark some discussion. I hope I can spark ideas that you can take home, challenge your nutritionists, challenge your programs, and see if we can make it progress in the industry. So these will be the areas that I will be focusing, and I will go quick on some of those, just to spark some discussion. Dr. Jeanette did a very nice presentation, a very good introduction of what I'm going to talk. Mine will be more related to the nutrition side on what we can do, starting with the yield. Controlling the weight of the gill is something we have been discussing, so I have some data to show today. Some key points during gestation. It's just a reminder on the use of the caliper, but I want to go into how we feed the sows early in gestation and late in gestation in respect to the levels of the diet. There's a lot of work, or I guess discussion we're doing around peripartum feeding. So I want to show you some data, maybe some new considerations for some nutrition interventions there too. And finally, some other nutritional considerations, just a brief summary of the work we did with the essential fatty acids, and then something that we're looking forward on the understanding of dietary fiber on feeding sows. And we have come a long way, so you have seen that too. We talk about mortality, but in the other hand too, productivity, the last 10 years have increased for about 25%. So looking here, some internal data, and the total born pigs from 2012 to 2022, there's a big jump there. So we have made good progress. And just to illustrate a little more my point, I wanted to compare this highly producing sow with a highly producing cow. And if I put her in a kilogram basis of the body weight, my high-producing sow is as productive or more sometimes than a high-producing cow. And if I go beyond and I compare the nutrient profile of the milk of the sow relative to the cow, there's a lot more nutrients that the sow it is outputting, right? So her needs are very high. That's my message. We have to understand how to feed her well, because like the last speaker, Dr. Jeanette explained us, we're losing a lot of those sows. So this is data, against internal data, and it's plotting the time of the gill or sow into the herd from 0 to the time where she has been removed from the herd. And I have shown here colts and deaths. The nice part of here that we are able to see, it is the different reasons on why she was removed from the herd. On the colt side, we see a lot of reproduction issues. On the deaths, we talk about lameness. That's your bluish color. And we talk about prolapses too. That's the yellow color here. right? And there's another factors playing in the role of removing of those sows. Something else that calls my attention here, there's peaks when they are removed from the herd, and that's around farrowing. So that tells me there's a lot of work we have to do it in understanding the sow, especially when she goes to farrow, because that's where we're losing most of the sows. And so something that we have started working on, and we talk about controlling the weight of gill. So that's been a problem. From one end, if she's too light, we know that she's going to lose productivity lifetime. In the other end, if she becomes too heavy, that's a problem too, right? She will have higher maintenance costs, and she will have a lot of locomotion problems. So that's what we have to be, that is why we have to avoid this. So I'll just skip this one really quick because I want to focus. This is a summary of the data. So this is 2 years of data on gills getting ready to be bred into the farm. And the graph in your left is showing the weight range of those gills at breeding. And by the color green, I'm pointing out to what is the percentage of those gills getting into the buckets that I want. So I have about 70% of the gills getting bred in the right weight. And if I go to the other graph in the right, it's showing me that those 70% gills, they're about in the right age. Okay? What happens with the rest, the 25, 30% of the gills, that's the problem. My heavy gills, they are coinciding to be the older gills in the herd too. So to me, this is a growing rate problem, but it's also an age problem. In this case, we're coming too late to select the gills for breeding. And so that's something we can do into our barns. That's prevent those fast-growing gills to get too old into our farms. So that's my message. But from the nutrition perspective, that's something I want to go deep. So here is just a reference to an early work from the National Pork Board, Ballet 2015, trying to control the weight of the gills prior to breeding. And the strategy used in this study was a couple things. They reduced lysine during the growth period of the gill by using fiber, by increasing the fiber content of the diet. And they were able to control weight of the gills, but in this case, they affected the age at puberty. So gills that had a lower lysine and higher fiber, they increased by about 10 days the age they get into puberty. So we tried to replicate this work into a more recent work into a research gill development barn using two approaches. Again, reducing lysine, but in this case, we weren't as aggressive as the study in 2015. And we used fiber too to fill the gastrointestinal capacity of the gill. So this is my low growth rate diet. And we decreased lysine from 6 to 11% in my GDU diets 1 to 3. I use a slightly lower energy value for those diets. And I use my fiber, so total dietary fiber in this case, I increased to about 2 times my standard program. So I went all the way to 20% to try to control weight. And in this case, we use, in this study, we use corn germ and wheat millings as the fiber source. So as I take those gills into a barn and at selection, we were able to reduce the weight of the gills by about 11 pounds. We were expecting a little more, but we were happy with 11 pounds. And the key aspect here is that we didn't affect reproduction of the gill. So the age at which they came into heat and they were bred, it didn't change. So that was, again, a good step for us moving forward. That was the original intention. Now, these gills, we're following the lifetime productivity of these gills, and I have data up to the second cycle of the gills. We haven't seen a change on the farrowing rate or the number of sows that get to the first cycle to farrow, or the number of pigs that are born from those gears. So that hasn't been different than my standard diet. What I start noticing, though, is that as they go into a second cycle, my numbers start to change. So I'm curious about the third cycle. I want to measure until my third cycle if I am able to retain more yields through that strategy. So there's more to come into that study. Then I take my yields and I go into the gestation phase. So this is a sow feeding program that we used back there in Hanover just to illustrate how to feed in the farm level, the levels of feed to the sows. And I want to focus in a couple things here. I want to remind you on the value of the caliper to assess the condition of the sow. We had questions about how to feed that sow early on and how to feed the sow later on. We also had a question on how to feed yields. We have a policy that we didn't want to underfeed her. So the minimum we can provide her was 4.5 pounds. But the question came, if you have a heavy yield and 30%, 40% of those are heavy, do you need to feed the same level or can you reduce the level? So it was a production question we wanted to answer. So I'll focus in those four really quick for you. The reminder on the caliper, the importance of it. When we adopted, it was because this is a good predictor of production. That was really what highlighted about the caliper, the use of the caliper. And this was shown by Mark Hanauer and Brian. If you go to this chart below, there's different parameters that they compare with the caliper. And the key here was, what was the best predictor for my subsequent reproduction? And the caliper stand out, right? So we adopted, we validated the caliper into our system. We wanted to get to the ranges to understand in what ranges of the caliper we maximize productivity. What ranges take us to the lowest pre-weaning mortality? What ranges of the caliper take us to the highest farrowing rate? So that's what we did. That's how we implement the caliper. That's how we adopt the different levels. So I'll move really quick into how to feed the sows, how we took the approach of feeding the sow early on into gestation. And so there was two considerations. I think we wanted to be careful on feeding too much because we didn't want to affect embryonic survival. But at the same time, we had to provide enough energy to keep the embryonic survival to a good level. So this is a study, 2013, showing the energy level provided to a sow, how that improved the progesterone level, and that was related to the survival of the embryos, so maximizes in the long time the total born. And I know there's some discussion and confusion here. So this is a second data set. In 2019, this will be Malman, 2019, exploring to the same question. What is the right level to feed that sow early into the gestation? And what it was nice on this study is that the authors, they divided, separated or balanced the sow by the caliper score. So less than 11 will be your teen sows. And they did respond, when you measure total born, to a higher level, but then you can also go beyond that higher level, right? Sows that had more than 11 caliper units, so your ideals and fat sows, they didn't respond to higher levels of feed. So that was a question that we wanted to answer for our system. So we did a study, a control study, using 522 sows. We balanced by parity and body condition. As a policy, and just to be careful with the level of feed, we had set it up a ceiling of 4 pounds. During the first week of gestation, we fed those sows 4 pounds, regardless of the body condition. Right now, we came back and say, why don't we feed the teen sows higher and simplify the program by the body condition? So that's what we did here. We fed the sows at breeding according to the body condition, anywhere from 3.5 to a heavy sow to 6 pounds per day to a teen sow. What I want to highlight is in this graph is the response on the farrowing rate, especially for the teen sows. If we limit feeding her, we're compromising her reproduction. So we compromise the farrowing rate. So that's something you don't want to do. The sooner she's recovering tissue reserves, the better for her reproduction. So that was the take-home message, and for us, it simplified our program. We changed it to scoring the body condition at breeding and feeding her according to the body condition. Now let's go to late gestation, because there has been a lot of discussion about BAM feeding and what level of feed provide the sow and what is the impact. And one consideration has been the piglet birth weight. So in this study, again by Meiermann, 2019, he titrated the feed level provided to the sow from day 90 of gestation, from 1.8 all the way to 3.3 kilograms per day. And he did see a response in the birth weight, but only to a level. There was a quadratic response here, and he didn't want to go beyond 2.3 kilograms. So it will suggest that, yes, there is an impact, but to a point, right? In the same note, if we track the performance of those sows during lactation, I think that's something we have to be worried, especially if we provide higher levels. And that's what this data set shows. It is tracking the feed intake of the sows during lactation, and what they observed was a similar pattern, but to be negative for higher levels of feed that were fed during the late gestation. So the more feed that was provided during late gestation, the worse the feed intake was during lactation, and that's something we don't want to see. So we had that controversy. We wanted to do the study ourselves too, to prove it with our sows and our system. So that's a little study we did with 420 sows, and we did the two strategies. To every body condition of sow, we did a no BAM feeding, so the same level she will receive with the body condition. And the BAM feeding we define as providing extra 2 pounds from day 90 all the way to when she is moved to farrowing. And I'm showing data on the lactation feed intake and stillborns and piglet birth weight. Again, and me again, outstanding here is the response on the teen sow. The teen sow, if I provided more feed, so 2 extra pounds during that late gestation, she increases her intake during lactation. So that was positive. At the same time, the number of pigs, stillborn pigs that she had, it was reduced. So it was a positive thing, but only for the teen sows. Sows that have been losing body condition over gestation, they were the ones benefiting for me to provide extra feed during that last phase. So that was our take home here in late gestation feeding. Now we had a question about what to feed a heavy sow during that late gestation. And unfortunately, we still had late gestation sows that are body condition 4 or 5, so heavy sows. And if you think about that sow, she is heavy, right? She's big, the body mass is big, and we're only providing 3.5 pounds in a stage where she is mobilizing a lot of nutrients to the litter. And she has mammary gland development still, some of them. And so that was a question. Do we need to go higher? So we titrate and we provide 1 extra pound or 2 extra pounds to that sow. And that will be expressed here in the energy basis. Now, what we learned, it was that she didn't benefit from the extra feed. You can provide an extra pound or 2, and what you're doing is sacrificing stillborns. So your stillborns was increased as I increased the level of feed, and my total pigs born alive, that was decreased over time. So it was a negative, so the answer was to keep feeding her 3.5 pounds from this study. As we talk about heavy sows, we also talk about heavy yields, and that's a question. You got 30% of your herd that's heavy, of the yield, 30% of the yields into the farm, and it's heavy. How you feed her, right? As a policy, we didn't want to underfeed her. So 4.5 pounds was the minimum level of feed to provide her during gestation. But we had to challenge that thought too. So that's what we did in this study. We only selected over-conditioned pregnant gills, 207 of those gills over different groups. And we provided our policy, which was 4.5 pounds, but we also provided a reduced feeding because we wanted to correct the body condition of those gills. So on the body weight, we were able to take 8 pounds out by the weaning. There wasn't much difference. It was 6 pounds by the time they farrow. If we go to the body condition score, there's about a unit in the cow in the body condition that we took it out. And if we put that into a population basis, if we start with 100% of those gills that are considered heavy, you see that naturally and providing the same level of 4.5 pounds, half of that population becomes ideal anyway. And you think about that gill, she's still growing, so some of that energy is devoted to growing. So it makes sense. If we reduce by a pound the level of feeding, we only gain an extra 10% of those gills into the ideal condition. And I don't know if that was a win, because after we start following their reproductive performance, here I'm showing the leader size during the first and the second parity. We didn't see much during the first parity on terms of total born, born alive, stillborn. What it becomes more interesting is the lifetime productivity of that gill. So as we go into the second cycle, I start to see a negative response in the number of pigs born alive for that gill that I limit feed during the first pregnancy. So that was very intriguing and interesting. And now we talk about losses of sows, and that's what I'm showing here. The graph in your left is the losses during that first cycle, and the graph in your right is the second cycle, so it's that subsequent cycle. And I'm showing the percentage of deaths and the percentage of culls for the sows that I fed the 4.5 pounds and the reduced level of 3.5 pounds. So during that first cycle, I do see that I decreased the cull rate, and that makes sense. You have 10% less fat sows, and probably those are not going to have lameness issues. That might be those that we don't get to remove from the farm because of lameness. What it was concerning to us, it was the percentage of dead sows in the second cycle. That was almost 2 times, more than 2 times, 3 times almost, the number of sows that die in that subsequent cycle. So this is concerning to us, right? If we underfeed her during the first pregnancy, we're compromising lifetime productivity, but also the survival of those sows. On the culling rate, that was the same. I think it's impacting positively, but we have to balance, right? And to me, culling, it might be something we can prevent. Deaths, that's going to occur. So maybe we have to choose one of the lesser of the worst, right, in this case. Now, finally, let's move to a sow that I'm moving into farrowing and how to feed her prior to farrowing. That was a question to us. So I'm just showing, you might be familiar with some of this data. The closer I can feed her prior to her farrowing, the less she's going to take it to farrow and the best outcome she's going to have. So in this data set, it's showing the time from the last meal in relationship to the farrowing duration. So if she has access to feed at least 3 hours before farrowing, I'm not compromising that farrowing duration. And that is in direct relationship to the stillborn pigs. If that number goes beyond 6 hours in the farrowing duration, I'm increasing my odds to have stillborns, right? And so something for you to consider, here's where I'm going to throw some nutritional considerations. It will be the use of fiber. So we did these studies in collaboration with NC State. So there's 4 of these studies, and I'm just summarizing the most important outcomes here. So we provided 1 or 2 pounds top dress as a top dress prior to farrowing. So she will be a sow consuming lactation feed, and I'm providing a fiber, either 1 pound or 2 pounds. Now what we did interestingly here is to use a insoluble fiber, so it will be wheat millings in this case, but we also use a soluble fiber, and that will be using some of the sugar beet pulp, just to decrease or increase that ratio of soluble to insoluble. The consistent response that we're observing on those sows was the reduction in the wean to estrus interval. And that was different sets of sows in different times. So it's a consistent response that's telling me something's changing in that sow if I can provide the right level of fiber and the right type of fiber. So there's a lot more that we can do in relation to fiber and in relation to the farrowing process of the sow. That's my message. Continuing on fiber, this is more interesting to me also. So this will be providing, again, fiber to gestating sows and looking into her survivability during that pregnancy. And in this case, we had to go beyond to what is known in fiber. We went all the way to 32% total dietary fiber. And here is the response on the mortality. So my control diet will have about 12% total dietary fiber, and I went to 32% total dietary fiber. And I was able to decrease. There's a tendency in the mortality relative to those sows that I placed in the trial. So answering some of the questions that we had in the previous presentation, yes, there's variation because of the environment, and I think there's tools that we can use to affect that variation. Lameness was the biggest reason and why we decreased mortality for these sows. There wasn't anything significant on prolapses, although numerically it was a reduction. And my final consideration here, so we have a little more time, is around essential fatty acids. So during lactation, how to feed the sow. So a lot of work we did during my time at NC State was around selecting the right type of lipids or fat to provide during lactation. So this is just really a meta-analysis we started with, and the consistent response that we observed in those past studies was the response of the leader to increasing levels of fat. So we replicate that study, but something we noted, it was the action of the fat in the reproduction of the sow. So we start wondering about the balance of essential fatty acids. And we're talking about linoleic and alpha-linolenic acids. So those will be parent essential fatty acids. You need to provide it into the diet. And at some level, and maybe in some cases, this is going to become deficient for the sow that is a high-producing sow. So essential fatty acid will have to be provided into the diet. What we found in the milk is that the sow wants to secrete as much as possible of these fatty acids because they are important for the development of the piglet, right? So this is just the system it happens. But also, these fatty acids, they are precursors of prostaglandins that are very important in the reproduction of sows. So tying those two together for us was important. So this is the study we did back then using 480 sows, different parities, and we titrate linoleic, so your omega-6 and your omega-3 fatty acid. We titrate those two, but we were very interested on the reproductive performance of the sow. And so this will be a good summary of our findings there. It was that as we were able to provide higher levels of linoleic acid, so that line in orange, sows were coming back in heat and were bred sooner and a greater proportion. And more importantly, it was that after they got bred, they were able to maintain pregnancy to a greater degree than a sow that had a lower essential fatty acid into the diet. So that was very important. We dropped good conclusions. And what will be the minimum level that a lactation diet should have for a sow to maintain pregnancy? More recently, Gehring validated these findings in a next study in the same facility. And he fed a controlled diet. And he also provided soybean oil to the diet. Just to validate what we have observed previously, he used tallow as the other source of lipid, having equal amount of energy in those two lactation diets was important. And we observed the same. If we fed essential fatty acids during lactation, we had more sows that farrow in the next cycle. And the response was bigger in the parity 3 sows, and that's also been consistent trial after trial. I think over time, they secrete more of these fatty acids into the milk, and over time, they become more deficient. So that's something interesting and something that got validated. Now, the bigger validation for me when I was into the system was this one. If I had to feed a higher level of linoleic acid, meant that I had to invest a little more money. Soybean oil today is very expensive. But if I can save piglets, if I can produce more, I can pay back for it. And so when we implemented this line, it shows you when we implemented the program, we call it sow essential fatty acid program, and that is happening during summers. The bars in red are showing you a reduction in the fecundity index. So when you take in account the farrowing rate and the number of pigs born, prior to implementation of the program, we see a lot of that happening, especially for those sows that are bred during summer months. After the implementation, you still see it, but it's not as deep as it was before. Okay? So we corrected, in a sense, some of that seasonality infertility we had for a time, at least into our system. Now, my last message is, with all these tools and all these messages that I'm providing you, and maybe when you take it home, we have to measure that implementation. That is key. So here's an example from a program we instituted very early on when we implemented the caliper into the system. So we wanted to go and validate that the people at the farms were actually measuring what they're supposed to. So in that sense, you can validate training, but you can also make sure they're using the tool correctly. So that's what this graph is showing. It's an assessment. So it'd be the accuracy of using the caliper. When we implemented, you can see that for one of the regions, there wasn't a good implementation. Unless you start measuring, that goes above 90% was what we wanted. And you have to do it consistently because it always can get bad. And again, this will be the proof that I had to show in the system that this is actually working. And this is the usage, feed usage pounds per sow reduction that we observe in the system after implementing. But my message here is, after that implementation, you have to go back, validate, measure, and be consistent with it. Now, I had the last slide. I had a great time at Hanor, and this is a great team that I had the honor to work with. Fantastic team. We have a great time. We're now looking forward for the future. Some of the topics that I talked today is what I want to do at Iowa State. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Chantal.
In the early study you mentioned where you were having two groups of animals with slow growth rate because of inadequate feeding or standard growth rate, you looked at stillbirth and big birth weight, and that was not changed in first or second parity. But did you look at growth rate of the piglets? Do you have an idea of the milk yield? That's what I'm wondering.
Oh, on those gears? No, we didn't get to measure the milk production of those.
But I mean, if you have the weight of the piglets at weaning,
Yeah.
Because you went to the second lactation, so that should be a data that would have been easy to.
Yeah, I wish we can. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, we couldn't get access. Those sows will go into the field now, different than a research farm. And that's where we wanted to track their survivability and lifetime productivity, so we couldn't get it to weigh. But fantastic point, yeah.
Does the slow growth rate also reduce the mammary development, and does that have an impact? I have no clue.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Chandel.
David, really nice data you presented. On your mortality study with fiber, where increasing TDF reduced lameness, did you look at that by body condition score of those sows? Like, you have any indication if, some of the thinner sows were saved or fatter? We've got some work with gut motility markers and fiber that suggests that some of the thinner sows actually have more satiety with fiber, and it may be inversely related. So I was just curious.
Yeah, great point. I need to get back to you on that one. I don't recall if we had the initial and final body condition, and that should have been balanced by treatment. I need to find that data.
Thanks. David, just a follow-up question on the fiber. Assume both studies were done with beet pulp fiber. Have you repeated any of that work with highly soluble fibers that don't have the swelling properties and satiety properties that beet pulp have?
Yeah, unfortunately, here in the U.S., it's hard to find a soluble fiber beyond sugar beet pulp. So no, it hasn't been repeated.
There are some other soluble fibers available here.
Oh, yeah? Okay, have to tell me which ones, yeah. So commercially, we were looking into, and I think soy hulls will be one that has really high fiber, and the soluble portion of it is very interesting that we can access commercially anyway, but beyond those 2 points.
Any other questions?
David, what's your current recommendation on bump feeding then? Are you bump feeding all, just bump feeding thin sows?
Yeah, so my own, and just take it like that, is I don't want to limit how much feed a thin sow can receive. And I can see benefits on bump feeding the thin sows. I don't see benefits on ideal and heavy sows, but that's the one that I can focus on feeding extra feed. Good point, Chris.
Any other questions? With that, let's give David another round of applause. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.